Peter, fantastic introduction and some great insights there. Thanks to Richard, everyone here, Clyde in the room, so he's been thanked a few times, and it's really great to be here. And as mentioned, Loughborough is known around the world as the leader in sport and exercise science. No doubt, thanks to the leadership to people like Clyde over the years. So to come here has been great, and to be hosted here has been fantastic. So we're going to talk about, I've changed the title of the talk a little bit today. Let me just make sure we've got there. So, and I think as Peter mentioned, what I want to talk about is how we can apply the research we're doing, hopefully to help cyclists in particular tonight, but also others. I don't have a cycling background, but I think like a lot of us here, growing up, having dreams of being a elite athlete, dreams of not having my mum cut my hair as well, but I've managed to at least achieve that one. But I've always had, there's a passion for how to do, how to train and how to get the most out of our bodies, and didn't make it as an elite athlete, but so I guess I've taken that then into science, and the interest over the years, how do we apply what we're using in or what we discover in the lab again to be able to help athletes to get the most out of training. And I really liked what some of the words that Peter said there, and I think they're really spot on, is that sometimes you get this almost competition between science and practice, and I think it doesn't work like that. Science doesn't have all the answers, and sometimes people see that as a weakness of science, that it doesn't have the answers, but we're never going to have the answers. And as long as, I think as Peter said, hopefully we're moving things forward and providing some insights, and sometimes what we're doing in science is just confirming what coaches have known for 30 years, and sometimes that's enough, but hopefully we're also providing some ideas to change some scientific practices. So with that, so that the goal of the talks, it's slightly different one was on the flyer, so hopefully there's not false advertising there, apologies for that. But so what I want to do is, optimising endurance adaptations, and can some of the ideas that we are getting in the lab, can athletes and coaches use that to improve performance? And a lot of the work we do is based on skeletal muscle biopsies. So you're going to see some of the work that I talk about today is using insights from what we see when we do training studies and look at the muscle, and can we use those to give some ideas for research. This is going to be, I guess, my roadmap for most of the talk. So people are familiar, a guy called Stephen Searle, who's from Texas originally, but has spent most of his academic life in Norway. So he's come up with this sort of polarised approach to training, and there's lots of different ways. So in Australia, so I just wanted to point this out, is we tend to work off 5 or 6 training zones based around the first and the lactate threshold. Whereas you'll see a lot of and I think talking to some of the guys today in the UK and other places, and indeed Stephen's work is based more on a 3-zone model, but basically the same idea. With the polarised idea is that what Stephen Searle did was looked at the training programs of a lot of elite athletes, specifically with rowers initially, but subsequently also with other athletes. And what he saw is that a lot of the training tended to be in this zone, maybe 70-80%, some up here, and tend to be why he's called it the polarised. It wasn't a lot in sort of this middle zone around about the lactate threshold. So I'm going to use this, as I said, as my, I guess, roadmap for today's presentation, and look at if there's any research, at least from the work we and others have done in the skeletal muscle, to support that idea, and also to suggest hopefully some other ideas as well. So I'll start here with the zone 1, and we've done research, and I won't do too much. Animals studies aren't always interesting for coaches, and we can get them to run, but it's pretty hard to get mice and rats to ride a bike, so it's probably even less interesting for people in the cycling community. But it's sometimes interesting just to see if the results match up. So we've done a little bit of work, and we've looked at you'll see this pop up quite a lot, and so citrate synthase is what we use as a marker of the mitochondrial content. So everyone, I'm sure you all know. So the mitochondria are the energy powerhouses in your muscle that are producing the energy to allow you to keep turning the pedals. So we're interested in how the training affects these organelles. And so we've done a lot of work, and it doesn't matter if we look in animals or in humans, and what we find is that and most of these are cycling studies in the lab, is that there seems to be a good correlation between training volume and changes in this marker of mitochondrial content. So the greater the training volume, the greater the improvements that you get in the mitochondria. So I guess in some respects backing up the need for this high volume part of the polarized approach. Okay. Apologies, this is a running slide, but it was difficult. There's some in swimming, and I couldn't find anything in cycling, but this is Kipchoge's volume distribution during the 7 weeks prior to breaking the marathon record in Berlin. And so you can see that the total volume of training is obviously heavily weighted towards this polarized approach. So most of his training is very high volume, very low intensity for running the marathon. So I guess, both from the lab and what from elite athletes are doing is supporting the need for this high volume. So it's a brief overview, and there's other studies, but I think, both from a lab and from a field approach, I think that there's good evidence that a high training volume is necessary to get the most out of endurance. We've also looked at the intensity side of the spectrum, and I guess the opposite of what we showed you there. In this case, when we look at training intensity and changes in the number or the amount of mitochondria, we see absolutely no relationship. So training harder, doing very high intensity, doesn't seem to provide a strong stimuli. In the muscle, and the other is how capable the mitochondria that are there to use oxygen to produce energy. And in this case, we see, when we start off at the lower intensity, as you go up, you can see this trend. So the higher the intensity seems to be important to get the functional improvements in the mitochondria. And again, we've compared different types of training. So here we've got moderate intensity in these white boxes, high intensity interval training, and then sprint interval training. And when we look at the mitochondrial function per mitochondria, what we see is only this very high intensity leads to the functional improvements in mitochondria. So again, this seems to be this polarized approach where the high volume is important for increasing the number of mitochondria, but the very high intensity is important for increasing the function of the mitochondria that are there. And again, if we go back to what athletes do, so I said before, lots of it high volume, and there's a little bit up here, so the track intervals and I guess the fartlek work, which is in this high intensity zone. And this study recently is quite a nice, practical example of this as well. So they compared this isn't from our group, but another group, compared two different types of training. So they actually did a polarized approach where they had 80% in zone 1 and 20% in zone 3. Or they had what they called here was I think they called it a threshold approach, where everything was below lactate threshold. So they've got 57% and 43% in zone 1s and 2. And then what they've got here is they did a time to fatigue at 95% of the peak power output. And as you can see, they got both groups improved, but there was a significantly greater improvement in their measure of endurance performance when they included this 20% of zone 3 training. So I think, again, from what the athletes are doing, but also what we're seeing in research studies, is doing some training in this, this zone 3, this high intensity, is important to get the most out of training. I want to spend a little bit of time on this bit, so the zone 2 more in the middle, and I guess, there's some, depending on who coaches that you talk to, I know some that like to do a lot of threshold training, and others, which are including Stephen Steele, I guess, recommend not doing a lot of training in this particular, around about the lactate threshold. And I remember, this was interesting, I was working with elite kayakers in Australia, and one time I was having a chat just with the coach, and she said, "Oh, lactic acid destroys mitochondria." I go, "It's pretty cool, I didn't know that." And but what's interesting is, sometimes, and I mean this in a really positive way, is that sometimes coaches, and Peter maybe will back me up on this, but you're with the athletes every day, so sometimes coaches have some really interesting observations, even if they maybe don't aren't connecting the science in exactly the right way. So she told me that, and I thought, she's working with Olympic athletes, she must know something. I did a search on the internet, couldn't find anything, but we did some, oops, sorry about that. We did do some research, so we decided then, so we did a bunch of different studies giving acids and bases to athletes and trying to understand whether or not this acidity does have an effect. And so we've done studies this time where we're taking muscle biopsies immediately after exercise. Yep, you can volunteer. Straight after exercise, and looking at changes in pH and also changes in the muscle. And so this is one of the studies we did here, and quite often at least in research, you'll see this sort of acronym pop up, so PGC1 alpha, and it's just a marker of mitochondrial adaptation. So if you do a bout of exercise, we'll take a biopsy, and if we see that in the muscle, then that's an indication that mitochondrial adaptations have been activated by that particular exercise. And presumably, if you get a greater increase, then you're getting a greater activation of the mitochondrial adaptations. And so we did this study here, and what we did is we had participants come in and do this high-intensity interval training session. So you can see there 10 by 2-minute intervals, 90% of Vo2 max, and 1 minute rest. And we got them to do it on 2 occasions. One time we just gave them a placebo, so that's just water, a neutral substance. And another time before they came in, we gave them a drink, we gave them a mild acid. And so the idea was to make their blood and their muscles mildly acidic while they did exercise, and see if that affected what we were seeing in the muscle. And so I think these results, they're quite interesting. So in the white is the placebo, and what we're getting is the normal increase in this marker of mitochondrial adaptation immediately after exercise. And when we gave them the acid, they're still getting it activated, but it got activated about half as much. So, the coach is starting to look a little bit less crazy now that, maybe something is happening there, that if you're having your muscles too acidic, maybe it's going to affect some of your adaptations to training. And this is from a guy in Canada, Marty Gabala's group, and they did the opposite. So same sort of concept, except they gave a placebo, or they gave some sodium bicarbonate before they did the exercise. So the opposite being, okay, your muscles are going to be acidic after exercise, but we'll give you some sodium bicarbonate so that they're less acidic after exercise. And when they did that, they saw there was a slightly greater increase in this marker of mitochondrial adaptations when they made the muscles less acidic. and this is probably the only other time I'll show you some animals, but we also did tried to, that's interesting, that's just one bout of exercise. We also did it with training. So we did this study with mice, and just concentrate on here, but what we were looking at is the mitochondrial function in these mice. So we had the mice there. I don't know if you can see in the picture, but what we had is we had the mice training on the treadmill, so that, they're training side by side. And before every single training session for 5 weeks, what we did is we had a small syringe, and we could put either water or we'd put sodium bicarbonate directly into their stomach, so that they were doing their exercise with sodium bicarbonate in their system. And what we've got here in blue is after 5 weeks, the control group, so that's their value there for their mitochondrial function. After training, as you'd expect, you got about a 25% improvement in the mitochondrial function in the placebo group. And then in the bicarb group, who are doing exactly the same training, they're on the treadmill at exactly the same time, so there's no way they couldn't do any different training. They got almost twice the improvement in mitochondrial function. So by making the muscles less acidic during training, we're able to get a greater training response, at least in this particular study. We also done a similar study in humans, although this time they drank it themselves. We didn't have to put a syringe down them, which is nice for everybody. And what we did here is exactly the same thing. So the same concept is that this was a group of females training on the cycle, doing interval training for 8 weeks, doing exactly the same interval training. And the only difference was that we had one group that we gave them placebo before every training session, and the other group we gave them some sodium bicarbonate before every single training session. And here is their performance test, which was a time to fatigue. So at the beginning, we'd matched them, so both groups were the same. The placebo group improved their time to fatigue after the 8 weeks of training, and the group that took sodium bicarbonate had an even greater improvement in their performance. Changes in VO2 peak were exactly the same. The bicarbonate group also had a significantly greater improvement in their lactate threshold. So again, it seemed to be that, again, this is, animals and now moderately trained females, but if we could make the muscles a little bit less acidic during training, then we could get greater improvements. This is again from the animal side. We've also seen some greater improvements in the ability to get lactate out of the muscles. I'll skip through these quickly. And normally this is, we did this study with the French Institute of Sport, so INSEP. So they're doing a classic cycle training, which seems to be popular over there, is that they do 30 seconds all out, 20 minutes rest, and then 30 seconds all out, which seems to be a common training protocol they use. And so we're doing the same thing, giving just a placebo before that training session, and we see a slight increase in what is this lactate transporter, which is in the muscle to help get lactate out of the muscle. When we give them bicarbonate before the same training session, we actually get a boost in that sort of protein. So it seems to be, at least from some of our research, that on multiple levels, if you can, you're not going to completely stop it, but if you can maybe mitigate the acidosis post-exercise, that maybe we can get more positive adaptations after exercise. I don't want to label this. I'll skip through this actually and get to the next bit. So what I want to say there is that, so I think, at least in my hands, I think there's some evidence, and I'm not saying don't ever do any training in zone 2 and that it's bad, but I think not, certainly I think from our research, certainly limiting the amount of training that's around about the lactate threshold, at least in my mind, I think that's probably a good strategy to get the most out of training. When we did these studies, I guess it was more to for a scientific purpose. So when we use the bicarbonate or the acid, it was more as an experimental manipulation. But I have seen some, this wasn't necessarily why we did the study, but some have asked about using sodium bicarbonate during training, and I've spoken to some people in Netherlands and some other countries where rowers and other endurance athletes have done that. So there's not a lot of research on there, but that may be something that people may want to consider, that if you are going to do the high intensity training, whether trialing that to see whether that can be beneficial. So I spent the first half, I wanted to mostly concentrate on those sort of training variables about distributing training in zone 1, zone 2 and 3. Obviously there's also the nutrition, so I just wanted to touch on some of the research that we and others have done there. So on top of that training distribution, can we manipulate nutrition to get better adaptations out of training? And I guess pretty popular at the moment is this idea of training low, so training with low muscle carbohydrate. So this is a pretty impressive review from Louise Burke and John Hawley, published in Science at the end of last year. But just going through this, I guess the theory that doing high intensity training sessions most likely with high glycogen, but having an argument for sometimes maybe not rushing to replace the muscle glycogen stores and doing some training sessions with low glycogen, and whether that can promote some of these adaptations, specifically in the mitochondria and also fat oxidation, which might lead to great adaptations. And so I think that like most things in science, there's a little bit of conflict out there, but some of the early studies have supported this. So this is from Sweden, so Kent Salen's lab. Again, as I said, you'll see this pop up quite often, this marker of mitochondrial adaptation. And what they did an endurance training session with either normal glycogen or low glycogen. And you can see here, in both cases, there was an increase in this marker of mitochondrial adaptations. But and these are some pretty good cyclists, when they did the exercise with low muscle glycogen, there was an even greater stimulation of this particular pathway. So some support. One of the things, and I'll show you some of our research which goes against that in a second, but one of the interesting things is quite often these studies is what they do, the way they'll deplete the muscle glycogen is they'll do maybe a prolonged high intensity exercise in the morning and then wait a few hours and then do another exercise session. So it's hard to know from this that type of literature, is it because there's a low muscle glycogen, or is it because you're training twice in one day that's achieving that particular effect? So we did a study to try and tease that out, so it's currently in review. And so just briefly, so basically what we did is we had the participants come in 3 times, and these are the muscle biopsies. They did high intensity exercise at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was 3 different conditions. One time is the control, so they've only come in and done that in the afternoon. They did the twice a day, where a couple of hours earlier they did a muscle glycogen depleting exercise, and then we didn't give them any carbohydrates here. And then they did a once-day condition, where the evening before they did that same muscle glycogen depleting exercise, and then they had the next day where we didn't give them any carbohydrates. So, as I said, the idea was in both of these instances, they're going to be exercising with low muscle glycogen, but here they would have done it twice by exercising twice in one day, and here they would have done it by exercising only once a day. And the paper's got lots of different results, but just briefly. So again, we've got our PGC1 alpha. We've got the control group. Muscle glycogen didn't have much of effect, but when we had them training twice in one day, we saw a massive effect on this marker of mitochondrial biogenesis. So at least with the high intensity exercise, a lot of what I think, the so-called train low effect is actually coming from a training twice a day effect. And so that was a single bout. Then we also did a training study where we had people train for 3 weeks using the once a day approach, which basically meant they trained 6 days a week, and the twice a day where they trained 3 days a week but training twice a day. And the once a day, we didn't see any change in mitochondrial function, and when they trained twice a day, so still the same volume of training, we got around about a 20% improvement in the mitochondrial function. So exactly the same total volume of training, but the only difference is between training once a day and training twice a day. So I think if we go back to, as I said, I'll keep coming back to this. So I think, we still need more research, but there is an argument for potentially, especially with the low intensity exercise, doing those in a low carbohydrate state. So whether it's, having your hard session the day before or via nutrition manipulation. So I think with the low intensity zone 1, combining that with zone work has the potential to be a strategy to augment the adaptations. And potentially, and this is really hard training, there's also an argument, maybe, I don't think you want to do it all the time, but occasionally employing this sort of twice a day training approach where you have some sort of training in the morning, then a few hours later, topping on top of that, doing another training session or another high intensity training session. At least from our results, again, that can be a way to start putting all this together and going beyond, I guess, just the zone 1, zone 2, zone 3 periodization, but also then combining different training sessions. We've also been interested in the use of cold water immersion and also recovery. So we've done a few studies there. This isn't from us, but we know that cold can activate some of these, activate the muscle as well. So there's been some studies looking at here where people did exercise and you get this small increase in PGC1 alpha. Or what they did is in here, the recovery after exercise, they get people to jump in a cold water bath for 10, 15, 20 minutes, depending on the protocol. And at least with some of these low intensity protocols, especially, you do see augmentation of the training stimulus. We've also looked at it with high intensity exercise, and so this is with sprint interval training, and the effect doesn't seem to be as great, but again, there's some indication that using the cold water immersion immediately after a high intensity session may help the athletes to get a better response to that particular training session. It seems to be much more powerful stimulus with low intensity exercise. And there's also, so Shona Halson, who was at the AIS at the study, also did a study using elite cyclists who are training at the Australian Institute of Sport. Didn't see a dramatic difference, but you can see here definitely a trend. So these groups, it was the squads, so they were all doing the same training session, cycling around Canberra for 4 weeks there, and they had one group who just recovered normally after every training session, and this group in black who did the cold water immersion immediately after each training session. So I think these differences weren't actually significant, but you can definitely see a trend there, especially after the taper, that even in the elite cyclists, there seemed to be a trend for cold water immersion helping out. So come back here, it starts to get a little bit more complicated, but so I think there's an argument that potentially adding cold water immersion, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that it's going to negatively affect the training adaptation, and certainly some evidence of a small positive effect by incorporating some cold water immersion. This is similar to some of the work that Richard's been doing. So we've also been interested in the idea of, it's becoming quite popular, is this blood flow occlusion idea. So doing the exercise, but using a blood pressure cuff or whatever it might be to occlude their muscles during exercise. And I think, people don't necessarily know the mechanisms, but some indication both with strength training and with endurance training that exercising with the muscle being occluded may be able to increase the adaptations. And so we've seen that as well. So you've got a control group who are doing exercise on the cycle, and we get the usual sort of small change in PGC1 alpha. When they did exactly the same exercise, but this was the ischemic condition, we've called it, so with the blood flow occlusion, you can see that it's a much greater effect. So potentially, especially with lower intensity exercise, because anyone who's done this, you can't do this, you can't do very high intensity exercise when you're doing the occlusion, but so maybe with some of the zone 1 training, and probably obviously more likely on a cycle ergometer or on the roller or something, but occasionally this may also be another strategy that can be incorporated into the training session to increase the training stimulus for the same training load. And so this is a single bout of exercise. We've just had a paper that'll be coming out in the next few weeks, I assume, but we also did a training study as well. So, the response to a single bout of exercise is interesting, but again, when we did the blood flow restriction, we got a greater improvement in, this is the incremental peak power, so we're doing one-legged knee extensions, classic sort of Copenhagen research, but getting significantly greater improvements in this measure of endurance performance when they trained with the blood flow restriction compared to just doing the control. So again, sort of superimposing on that is, probably shouldn't have drawn this much at this end, but definitely with the more sort of zone 1 type training, that may be another way to, I think as you're working with athletes, looking for a way to get some variety into training, but that may be a way on some training sessions to occasionally introduce some blood flow restriction to try and get even greater adaptations out of this zone 1 training. I wanted to, how are we going for time?
Minutes?
Yep, perfect. I just wanted to finish up with a couple of other observations. And I was talking to the guys and girls at Loughborough Sport this afternoon. So this is from one of my PhD students. Is if you're going through the literature or working with athletes or doing research, we've been talking about zone 1 and zone 2 and zone 3, and that relies on determining the lactate threshold. And these are all of the possible lactate thresholds that you can calculate depending on what you like. So you can see, so this ranging from 204 in this particular, so this is an actual athlete in our study, 243 watts up to 338 watts. So there's about 100 watts different depending on the lactate threshold. So if I'm telling you that, this is your zone 2 training here, or your zone 2 training is up here, then it's obviously a big difference. So I only put that in there not to confuse or anything, but just to say that, the methodology is really important. So when, if you're talking about the lactate threshold or you're talking about zone 1, 2, or 3, it's critical that, you're comparing apples with apples. And if you're comparing studies or tests or whatever it might be, make sure you know what lactate threshold you're actually referring to. And so in this, anyone who's interested to, Nick, my PhD student, did an awesome job with this paper, but we've made some recommendations on what we think is the best way to determine the lactate threshold if you're going to be using it for training. It's jumping around a bit, sorry. The other thing I wanted to point out as well is that quite often you'll see studies talking about training at a percentage of VO2 max, and that's also a little bit problematic because it also depends on the type of athlete and also the type of incremental protocol that you use to determine the the peak power. So, depending on the athlete and the protocol, the lactate threshold could range from 50 to 90% of VO2 max. So, if you're looking at a paper sometime, or, could be two studies that say that they've done their training at 70% of VO2 max and they've got completely different results, it's probably because depending on the athlete or depending on how they determined it, you're going to get a completely different physiological stimulus. And so that then becomes important when you're designing training. So this is a really great paper from Ed Coyle back in '84, but he had a group of pretty good cyclists who had the same VO2 max, but had he grouped them into high lactate threshold and low lactate threshold. So you can see here, if you had told them to exercise at 70% of VO2 max, these guys here are going to be training somewhere in L2, L3 from our scheme, or level 5 if you're someone with a low lactate threshold. So there's obviously going to be that's a massive difference in the physiological stimulus. So at least in the work that I do with athletes and also the research, that's why I prefer using lactate thresholds to demarcate the different training zones, rather than using a heart rate max or VO2 max. There we go. I like this as, I'll finish as the last 3 slides, I think, is it's a really nice paper. In some ways it's obvious, but it's also sometimes nice to see it in the research. But what this study did here is they looked at, again, this, everyone will know PGC1 alpha now, looked at this marker, and they had them do the same exercise a bunch of times. And you see this sort of sawtooth pattern. So the first time you do the exercise, it's a powerful stimulus to activate the mitochondria. And then each time you come back, you're getting a slightly slower stimulus. So, anyone who works with athletes knows about progressive overload and increasing the stimulus. But I think sometimes maybe we take it for granted. So this is a really nice demonstration that if you're not using progressive overload, you're going to get a smaller stimulus on the muscle each time. And we've done something similar, again looking at this but in a slightly different way. This is really interesting, I think. So this is our marker, PGC1 alpha. When they came in, this is the increase of this protein in the nucleus. But anyway, you see it increase, quite markedly. Then we sent people away and trained them for 3 weeks, quite hard. And then we got them to come back and do exactly the same exercise, and absolutely nothing happened in terms of the stimulus for mitochondrial adaptation. So again, I think just another nice example of the need for the progressive overload and seeing it at the muscle level. If you're not increasing that exercise stimulus, then you're still going to get some adaptations, but you can definitely see a dampening of what's happening at the muscle. And I think it's also, this is important to point out as well, is that when we do training, we can get really, quite, especially if we're using moderately trained people, we can get pretty dramatic changes. Here we're looking at mitochondrial function with training, but as soon as you stop the training, basically, even within about 2 weeks, we're losing almost all of the mitochondrial adaptations that we were seeing by training. So I guess, just the importance of maintenance, and also, we don't have time to talk about tonight, but I guess in terms of, getting the taper right, that if you're not careful, then you can very quickly lose a lot of these adaptations. So I'll finish here. In terms of, Seal also talks about what he's called here his hierarchy of endurance training needs. So I think it's a nice way to sort of close the circle. So I've sort of talked mostly about this. I think, it's pretty well established the volume of training and the need to do some high-intensity training, and also trying to get this distribution right. So predominantly doing the high volume, but also making sure there's some high intensity. These, I think, he's got these at the bottom of the pyramid, because I think that's these are the key things. Sometimes it's become really popular to talk about the 1%ers, but we need to think about the 99 percenters because they're the ones that are going to get you the most. So I think it's really important to get this part right. You can start thinking about some of these. So I briefly sort of touched on the tapering, but definitely some sort of nutrition, cold water, blood flow restriction. You can start, once you've got this base right, then you can start thinking about potentially how do you go about using these to get that last couple of percent. To finish there, I want to thank, I presented a fair bit of data, hopefully not too much data there, sorry. But a lot of that gets done by my PhD students. I wanted to thank my family as well for letting me come over here, and a couple of days after I get back they'll start talking to me again. But, thank them, and thank you all as well. So hopefully it's given you a little bit of an idea, at least how I think some of the findings in the lab can give some ideas on how to modify training. Thank you.